On the morning of August 27, 1875, a body was found floating in San Francisco Bay near Meigs Wharf. The man had been one of the city's most powerful financiers, the founder of the Bank of California, and the visionary behind a dozen civic projects that had transformed a gold rush boomtown into a world-class metropolis. Hours earlier, he had lost control of his bank. Now he was dead at 49. 50,000 people lined the streets of San Francisco for his funeral procession. 8,000 attended a public memorial service where speakers called him the greatest builder the city had ever known. His widow and 4 children mourned a man who had gambled everything on impossible dreams. One of those dreams, the largest, most expensive hotel ever constructed in the western United States, stood nearly complete just blocks from where his body had been recovered. 2 months later, on October 2, 1875, that hotel opened its doors. 7 stories tall, occupying an entire city block, containing 755 guest rooms and 26 million bricks, it represented the pinnacle of Gilded Age ambition. Its creator never walked through its lobby or slept in one of its suites. He never saw the gaslit chandeliers illuminate the grand court or watched the first horse-drawn carriages roll beneath its glass skylight. But the Palace Hotel opened anyway, and the story of how it came to exist begins not with the man who built it, but with the city that demanded it. Chapter 1. The Golden City. The village of Yerba Buena had fewer than 1,000 residents in 1848 when James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Within 18 months, the renamed San Francisco exploded to a population of 25,000. By 1850, it had become the de facto capital of American ambition in the West, a chaotic port city where ships arrived daily carrying fortune seekers from every corner of the globe and departed loaded with California gold. The transformation was violent and absolute. Streets that had been dirt paths between Spanish mission buildings became commercial thoroughfares lined with hastily constructed wooden buildings. Tents gave way to frame houses, which gave way to brick hotels and banks. The harbor filled with hundreds of abandoned ships as crews deserted for the gold fields. Their hulls eventually incorporated into wharves and buildings as the waterfront expanded into the bay. By 1860, San Francisco's population had reached 56,000, and the city had established itself as the financial center of the entire Pacific coast. The source of that financial power lay 250 miles east in the Nevada Territory. In 1859, prospectors discovered the Comstock Lode near Virginia City, the richest silver deposit ever found in North America. The ore body would ultimately yield more than $400 million in silver and gold over the next 2 decades, and almost all of that wealth flowed through San Francisco. The city's bankers financed the mines, its merchants supplied the equipment, its stock exchange traded the mining shares, its lawyers settled the disputes, and its newspapers chronicled every boom and bust. The men who controlled the Comstock mines built mansions on San Francisco's Nob Hill that rivaled anything in New York or Boston. They founded banks, opened theaters, and established themselves as a new aristocracy of Western wealth. But one thing the city conspicuously lacked was a hotel worthy of their aspirations. San Francisco had plenty of respectable hotels, the Occidental, the Cosmopolitan, the Lick House, but nothing that could compete with the grand hotels of Europe or even the finest establishments in New York. This mattered more than civic pride. San Francisco aspired to be taken seriously as a world-class city, and world-class cities had landmark hotels. Paris had the Grand Hotel, with its palatial courtyard and 800 rooms. New York had the Windsor and the Fifth Avenue Hotel, both celebrated for their opulence and modern conveniences. London had Claridge's and the Langham. These weren't just places to sleep. They were symbols of urban sophistication, gathering places for the wealthy and powerful, architectural statements that a city had arrived. The California businessman who traveled to New York or Paris inevitably returned with stories of marble lobbies, hydraulic elevators, private bathrooms, and dining rooms that could seat hundreds beneath crystal chandeliers. These tales only emphasized what San Francisco lacked. The city had the wealth to build such a hotel. It had the ambition. What it needed was someone audacious enough to attempt it, someone willing to spend a fortune to create a palace that would announce to the world that San Francisco belonged in the company of the great cities of the age. By the early 1870s, with Comstock silver still pouring into the city's banks and its population approaching 150,000, the time seemed right. San Francisco was no longer a frontier boomtown. It was a Gilded Age metropolis, with all the confidence and swagger that implied. The question wasn't whether someone would build a grand hotel, but who would do it, and whether they could pull it off without bankrupting themselves in the process. Chapter 2: The Man Who Built San Francisco. William Chapman Ralston arrived in San Francisco in 1854 with nothing but experience. He had spent the previous few years as a clerk and sometime captain on the steamships that carried gold seekers from Panama to California, and he understood something that many arriving fortune hunters did not. The real money wasn't in the gold fields. It was in transporting the miners, supplying their equipment, and managing their wealth once they found it. Born in Wellsville, Ohio in 1826, Ralston possessed the kind of restless energy and outsized ambition that the young city rewarded. He was 28 when he settled in San Francisco, and within a decade he had transformed himself from a steamship company employee into one of the most powerful financiers on the Pacific coast. His method was straightforward: identify opportunities others considered too risky, commit completely, and move fast enough that caution never caught up with ambition. In 1864, Ralston co-founded the Bank of California with Darius Ogden Mills, a respected Sacramento banker whose conservative reputation provided the perfect counterbalance to Ralston's aggressive instincts. Mills served as president, but everyone understood that Ralston, serving as cashier and de facto chief executive, drove the bank's strategy. While Mills provided stability and credibility, Ralston provided vision and velocity. The Bank of California opened with $2 million in capital and immediately positioned itself as the premier financial institution west of Chicago. Ralston's strategy centered on the Comstock lode. He understood that whoever controlled the financing for Nevada's silver mines would control the wealth they generated. The bank extended credit liberally to mining operations, accepted mining stock as collateral, and soon held positions in dozens of Comstock properties. When mines succeeded, the bank profited from both the loans and the stock appreciation. When they failed, the bank often ended up owning the properties outright. Within 2 years of its founding, the Bank of California had become the financial engine of the entire Comstock region. But Ralston's ambitions extended far beyond banking. He saw himself as a city builder, and he poured money, often the bank's money, though the distinction sometimes blurred, into projects designed to elevate San Francisco's status. In 1869, he financed the construction of the California Theater on Bush Street, a 1,800-seat palace with gilded boxes and gas-lit chandeliers that could compete with any theater in New York. He invested in the Spring Valley Water Company, which supplied the city's water. He backed the formation of the University of California at Berkeley. He funded the construction of New Montgomery Street, cutting a new thoroughfare through the dense fabric south of Market Street. His personal life reflected the same grand scale. In Belmont, 25 miles south of San Francisco, Ralston built a summer estate that became known as Ralston Hall. The Italianate mansion, set on 14 acres, featured marble imported from Italy, wood paneling from the finest forests, and grounds that required a staff of gardeners to maintain. Though intended as a summer retreat, his wife Elizabeth and their 4 children lived there year-round, while Ralston divided his time between Belmont and the city. The estate included its own water system, supplied by a reservoir Ralston had constructed in the hills above the property, an engineering project that employed nearly 100 workers and created what locals called Water Dog Lake. By the early 1870s, Ralston's financial empire seemed limitless. The Bank of California controlled significant stakes in Comstock mines that were producing millions in silver annually. But managing those Nevada operations from San Francisco presented challenges, and Ralston needed someone on the ground in Virginia City who could represent the bank's interests aggressively. In 1864, he hired William Sharon, a fellow Ohioan who had come to California during the gold rush, made and lost a fortune in real estate, and was looking for another opportunity. Sharon had the right combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and willingness to do whatever the situation required. Ralston installed him as manager of the bank's Virginia City branch and gave him broad authority to act on the bank's behalf. The arrangement proved immediately profitable. Sharon understood the Comstock in ways that San Francisco bankers could not, and he moved decisively to expand the bank's control over Nevada's mining operations. While Sharon built the bank's Nevada empire, Ralston continued to expand his vision for San Francisco. And by 1873, he had identified the project that would define his legacy, a hotel unlike anything the American West had ever seen. It would occupy an entire city block. It would have more rooms than any hotel in the country. It would be fireproof, earthquake-resistant, and equipped with every modern convenience available. It would cost a fortune to build, but that had never stopped William Ralston before. Chapter 3. The Nevada Connection. William Sharon stepped off the stagecoach in Virginia City in the summer of 1864 with instructions from William Ralston that were both simple and ambitious. Take control of the Comstock lode on behalf of the Bank of California. The mining camp perched on the side of Mount Davidson had exploded from a tent settlement to a city of 15,000 in just 5 years, and chaos still defined its operations. Dozens of mining companies worked adjacent claims, often fighting legal battles over where one ore body ended and another began. Mills processed silver ore at wildly varying rates of efficiency. Timber companies stripped the mountainsides to supply lumber for the miles of underground tunnels. And through it all, miners and investors gambled fortunes on rumors, stock tips, and the hope that the next blast of dynamite would reveal another bonanza. Sharon opened the Bank of California's Virginia City branch on September 6, 1864, in a small building on C Street. His initial role appeared straightforward: provide banking services to the mining district and funnel Comstock profits back to San Francisco. But Sharon understood that the real opportunity lay not in serving the mining industry, but in owning it. Within months, he had developed a strategy that would make him one of the wealthiest men in Nevada and one of the most controversial. The method was elegant in its simplicity. Sharon offered loans to struggling mining operations at rates that appeared generous, particularly to mine owners who had been rejected by other lenders. When those operations failed to meet their obligations, and many did, given the unpredictable nature of silver mining, the Bank of California foreclosed and took ownership of the properties. Sharon didn't simply acquire failing mines, he consolidated them, improved their operations, and integrated them into a network of Bank of California holdings that soon dominated the Comstock. He applied the same approach to the reduction mills that processed ore into silver bars. One by one, mills that had operated independently found themselves unable to compete with Bank of California financing and eventually sold out or lost their properties to foreclosure. By 1867, Sharon controlled most of the major mills in the district, which gave him leverage over mine owners who needed somewhere to process their ore. Mines that cooperated with the bank received favorable mill rates and access to capital. Those that resisted found themselves paying premium prices or unable to secure mill time at all. Transportation presented another opportunity for consolidation, moving ore from mines to mills, timber from forests to mines, and silver bars from mills to San Francisco required an efficient rail system. In 1869, Sharon organized the construction of the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, a narrow-gauge line that would connect Virginia City to the Transcontinental Railroad at Reno. The project received significant government subsidies, and when it opened in 1870, the Virginia and Truckee gave Sharon control over the primary transportation artery of the entire mining district. Mines and mills that wanted to move their products now paid Sharon's railroad to do it. Stock manipulation completed Sharon's control. As manager of the Bank of California's Virginia City operations, he received information about mine production before it became public. When a mine showed signs of rich ore, Sharon and his San Francisco partners bought stock before the news reached the market. When production declined, They sold before the stock price collapsed. The Virginia City Territorial Enterprise, which Sharon eventually purchased, ensured that news favorable to Bank of California interests received prominent coverage, while problems at competing operations made front-page headlines. By the early 1870s, Sharon's network controlled approximately a dozen major Comstock mines, most of the important reduction mills, the primary railroad, significant timber operations, and even Virginia City's water system. The locals called him the King of the Comstock, though not as a compliment. An editorial in the Territorial Enterprise before Sharon bought the paper had greeted his announced Senate campaign with the observation that he was feared, hated, and despised in Nevada. Sharon appeared unbothered by such sentiments. He had come to Virginia City to make money, and he had succeeded beyond even Ralston's expectations. In 1874, Sharon decided he wanted a seat in the United States Senate. The position required winning election by the Nevada State Legislature, and Sharon approached the campaign with the same directness he had applied to mining consolidation. He purchased the Territorial Enterprise to control its editorial voice. He made strategic investments in legislators' business ventures. He distributed cash where it proved necessary. The campaign reportedly cost him nearly $1 million, but on March 4, 1875, William Sharon took his seat as one of Nevada's 2 senators. The money that had built Sharon's Nevada empire flowed steadily back to San Francisco, where Ralston converted it into theaters, water systems, real estate developments, and an increasingly elaborate vision for a hotel that would crown all his other achievements. Sharon had given Ralston the resources to dream on a grand scale. Whether those resources would prove sufficient remained to be seen. Chapter 4. 26 Million Bricks. In early 1873, William Ralston acquired an entire city block at the intersection of Market and New Montgomery Streets for $400,000. The site sat at the heart of San Francisco's expanding business district, easily accessible from the waterfront and the financial center on California Street. Ralston wanted the location to make a statement, and the property delivered, large enough to accommodate his vision, prominent enough to be impossible to ignore. For the architect, Ralston hired John P. Gaynor with explicit instructions to study the grand hotels of Europe and create something that would surpass them all. Gaynor spent months examining the finest establishments in Paris, Vienna, and London, taking detailed notes on their layouts, their innovations, and their failures. He returned to San Francisco with plans for a structure that would be 7 stories tall, contain 755 guest rooms, and occupy every square foot of the Market Street block. The building would rise in the shape of a massive hollow square, with the interior courtyard serving as the hotel's defining feature. Construction began in February 1874, when grading crews broke ground on the site. Within weeks, an army of workers had transformed the city block into an organized chaos of lumber, iron, and brick. The project required 16 brick yards operating constantly to supply the 26 million bricks needed for the walls. 3 granite quarries cut stone for the foundations and facing. 4 boiler manufacturing companies produced the heating systems. Timber came from forests up and down the California coast, much of it processed in mills that Ralston had invested in years earlier. The scale of the project impressed even San Francisco's construction veterans. The building's exterior walls rose 7 stories, topped with 3 separate mansard roofs trimmed with iron widow's walks. 16 bay windows, each forming a 6-story column, dominated the Market Street facade. The windows alone numbered 7,000, and each of the 755 rooms would have at least 1 fireplace, 804 fireplaces in total, each requiring its own flue through the brick walls to the roof. But the building's true innovation lay in what couldn't be seen from the street. Gaynor designed the hotel to be as close to fireproof and earthquake-resistant as 19th century engineering allowed. The walls incorporated iron reinforcing, a relatively new technique that Ralston had insisted upon after watching San Francisco's wooden buildings burn in previous fires. The foundations went deep, anchored to bedrock to withstand the earthquakes that periodically shook the city. The Grand Court occupied the center of the hollow square, a space large enough to accommodate multiple horse-drawn carriages simultaneously. Gaynor topped it with a massive glass skylight supported by iron trusses, allowing natural light to flood the interior while protecting guests from San Francisco's wind and fog. Marble pillars lined the court, and the floor was designed to support the weight of carriages rolling directly into the hotel's heart. Guests would step from their carriages under cover, protected from the elements, and find themselves in what Gaynor envisioned as the most dramatic hotel entrance in the world. Technology pervaded every aspect of the design. The hotel would have 5 hydraulic elevators, the first on the West Coast designed specifically to transport people rather than freight. Ralston insisted on calling them rising rooms to emphasize their novelty and reassure guests who might be nervous about the technology. Each guest room would have an electric call button connected to the front desk, allowing guests to summon service without leaving their rooms. Every room would have access to a private bathroom, or at minimum, a bathroom shared between 2 rooms, a level of convenience almost unheard of in American hotels of the period. The plumbing system alone represented a massive undertaking. Gaynor designed a network of pipes that would supply both hot and cold running water to hundreds of rooms simultaneously. But Ralston, remembering San Francisco's history of devastating fires, went further. He ordered the construction of a reservoir beneath the hotel capable of holding 630,000 gallons of water drawn from 4 artesian wells. If fire broke out, the hotel would have its own independent water supply, enough to fight flames for hours even if the city's water mains failed. Furniture for 755 rooms had to be manufactured, most of it in San Francisco to Ralston's specifications. The contract went to the Kimball Manufacturing Company with the requirement that all wood come from California forests. Ralston wanted the palace to be a California creation, not an Eastern import. Carpets, drapes, chandeliers, mirrors, and thousands of other furnishings had to be ordered, delivered, and installed. The logistics of coordinating 16 brick yards, 3 granite quarries, dozens of suppliers, and hundreds of workers required the kind of organizational ability that had made Ralston successful in banking and mining. By the summer of 1875, the building stood nearly complete. The exterior walls were finished, the mansard roofs in place, the windows installed. Inside, workers were completing the plasterwork and installing fixtures. The Grand Court's glass skylight caught the afternoon sun, sending light deep into the interior corridors. The hydraulic elevators had been tested and worked smoothly. The artesian wells pumped water into the reservoir, the fireplaces drew properly, the gas lines were connected, and the call button system functioned. The project had consumed nearly $5 million, almost 3 times Ralston's original estimate. Every cost overrun had been funded by the Bank of California, sometimes through loans, sometimes through the creative accounting that allowed Ralston to blur the line between his personal projects and the bank's investments. But standing on Market Street and looking at the 7-story palace rising above the surrounding buildings, Ralston could feel confident that he had created exactly what he had promised. A hotel unlike anything the American West had ever seen. In 2 months, it would open to the public. He just needed to survive until October. Chapter 5. The Collapse. On the morning of Thursday, August 26, 1875, worried depositors began gathering outside the Bank of California's headquarters on California Street before the doors opened. Rumors had circulated for days about the bank's exposure to failing mining ventures and Ralston's expensive building projects. By the time the bank opened at 10 o'clock, a crowd had formed. They wanted their money. The bank run started quietly. A few dozen depositors withdrew their accounts, then a few dozen more. By noon, the line stretched down California Street. Tellers counted out gold coin and currency as quickly as they could, but the requests kept coming. Ralston stood in the banking hall watching his empire dissolve in real time. By the end of the day, depositors had withdrawn $1.4 million, roughly equivalent to the bank's entire liquid reserves. At 3 o'clock, the doors closed. The Bank of California had suspended operations. That evening, the bank's board of directors convened an emergency meeting. They examined the books and discovered what Ralston had been hiding for months. The bank's assets included millions of dollars in loans to Ralston's personal ventures, many of them secured by nothing more than Ralston's promises. The Palace Hotel alone had drained close to $5 million from the bank, most of it diverted through a web of loans and investments that erased any meaningful separation between Ralston's projects and the bank's business. The Virginia and Truckee Railroad, the Spring Valley Water Company, various real estate schemes, all had been funded with money that the bank's depositors believed was safely invested in legitimate commercial ventures. The directors gave Ralston no choice. On the morning of Friday, August 27th, they demanded his resignation as president. Ralston signed the papers without argument. He also executed a deed of trust, transferring all his personal assets to William Sharon, ostensibly to allow Sharon to liquidate the properties and repay Ralston's debts to the bank. The meeting ended before noon. Ralston left the bank and walked north toward the waterfront. He stopped at his club for a brief conversation, then continued to the Neptune bathhouse at North Beach, where he regularly swam in San Francisco Bay during summer afternoons. Several people saw him enter the water around 1 o'clock. He swam out toward Alcatraz as he usually did, moving with strong, confident strokes. Several hours later, his body was recovered from the water near Meigs Wharf. When word reached the city, thousands of people gathered at the waterfront. Many refused to believe it. Some insisted he had been murdered. Others claimed he had faked his death and would reappear once the crisis passed. The coroner's inquest conducted an autopsy the next day. The medical examination found no water in Ralston's lungs, no signs of drowning. The verdict: death by apoplectic stroke. The timing of the stroke, occurring while Ralston swam in the bay just hours after losing everything, invited speculation that would never fully resolve. But the official cause mattered to Elizabeth Ralston and her 4 children, because life insurance policies paid out for strokes but not for suicide. On September 8th, Ralston's funeral procession drew crowds estimated at 50,000, one of the largest public gatherings in the city's history. At the memorial service that followed, attended by 8,000 mourners, speaker after speaker rose to praise the man they called San Francisco's greatest builder. The newspapers published eulogies describing his vision, his generosity, his unwavering faith in San Francisco's future. Some accounts mentioned his financial irregularities, but quickly moved past them to focus on his achievements. Within days of the funeral, William Sharon had organized a committee to reopen the Bank of California and began the process of sorting through Ralston's tangled financial affairs. The deed of trust that Ralston had signed gave Sharon control over virtually everything: Ralston Hall, New Montgomery Street, the city's waterworks, numerous downtown properties, and the nearly complete Palace Hotel. Sharon paid Ralston's widow $50,000 for Ralston Hall, a property worth millions, and acquired the rest of the estate by assuming debts that he would later settle at pennies on the dollar. By early October, Sharon had reorganized the Bank of California, which reopened with $2 million in gold reserves and Darius Mills restored as president. Sharon delivered a public eulogy to his late friend Ralston, praising the banker's vision while carefully avoiding any discussion of how he himself had profited from the collapse. On October 2nd, 1875, exactly 5 weeks after Ralston's death, the Palace Hotel opened its doors to long-term residents. 2 weeks later, it began accepting transient guests. The largest, most expensive hotel ever built in the western United States welcomed its first visitors without the man who had dreamed it into existence. William Sharon stood at the entrance greeting guests, the new owner of a palace built with another man's ambition and the Bank of California's money. Chapter 6. Opening Day. The band began playing at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of October 2nd, 1875. Carriages rolled through the Grand Court's main entrance, depositing the first long-term residents who had reserved suites for the season. William Sharon moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and deflecting questions about Ralston with practiced ease. The newspapers covered the opening extensively, marveling at the scale and luxury, but noting the absence of the man whose vision had created it. The hotel began with long-term residents rather than transient guests, a strategic decision that allowed the staff to work through operational problems before facing the demands of daily arrivals and departures. 2 weeks later, the palace opened to all guests, and within months it had established itself as San Francisco's premier accommodation. Sharon had acquired not just a building, but a money-making machine. With 755 rooms rarely full but commanding premium rates, the hotel generated steady income that helped offset the fortune he had spent acquiring it. Sharon treated the palace as both an investment and a residence. He maintained a suite on an upper floor where he lived when in San Francisco, which was most of the time despite his position as a United States Senator from Nevada. His Senate term had begun in March 1875, but Washington held little interest for him. The Senate met for only part of each year, and Sharon attended fewer than one session in 20. His voting record became legendary for its absence. Historians would later calculate that he participated in less than 1% of Senate roll calls during his 6-year term. The arrangement suited Sharon perfectly. He could claim the prestige of a Senate seat while conducting his actual business from the Palace Bar and the bank offices on California Street. Nevada's other senator carried the state's legislative work while Sharon focused on consolidating his California holdings. When criticism arose about his absenteeism, Sharon ignored it. He had paid good money for that Senate seat, and he would use it however he pleased. The palace itself required surprisingly little of Sharon's attention. He had hired Warren Leland, one of the country's most experienced hotel managers, to oversee daily operations. Leland had managed major hotels in New York and brought professional systems to everything from housekeeping to accounting. The staff learned quickly that Leland demanded precision, and the hotel developed a reputation for service that matched its architectural grandeur. In 1880, Sharon's personal life became complicated when he met Sarah Althea Hill, a 30-year-old woman who began visiting him at the palace. Hill was striking in appearance and forceful in personality, qualities that apparently appealed to the 59-year-old widower. She stayed in rooms at Sharon's nearby Grand Hotel and visited the palace regularly, using a connecting bridge that spanned New Montgomery Street. The relationship lasted about a year before ending acrimoniously. The aftermath consumed much of the next 5 years. Hill sued Sharon for divorce in 1883, producing a marriage contract that she claimed proved they had been secretly married. Sharon's attorneys called the document a forgery. The case became a San Francisco sensation, with newspapers publishing testimony about intimate details that both parties probably wished had remained private. Hill's behavior grew increasingly erratic during the proceedings, and she eventually married her own attorney, David Terry, a former California Supreme Court justice with a violent reputation. Sharon continued managing his business interests while the lawsuit ground through the courts, but his health began declining in 1885. He spent his final months at Ralston Hall, the Belmont estate that had once been Ralston's pride. On November 13, 1885, William Sharon died at age 64, still embroiled in the Hill litigation and still defending his fortune against her claims. His estate would fight those claims for years after his death. The Palace Hotel continued operating without interruption. Sharon's heirs inherited the property along with his other San Francisco holdings, and they maintained Warren Leland as manager. The hotel that had opened under a cloud of tragedy, its creator dead before the doors opened, now belonged to the estate of the man who had acquired it through that tragedy. But the palace itself seemed indifferent to questions of ownership. It had survived Ralston's death and Sharon's scandals. It would continue serving guests regardless of who held the deed. Chapter 7. The Palace in its Glory. From its opening, the palace became San Francisco's natural gathering place for distinguished visitors. Presidents stayed in its suites: Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt. They moved through the Grand Court while crowds gathered on Market Street to catch glimpses of power. King Kalakaua of Hawaii made the palace his San Francisco residence during the 1880s. The monarch's visits brought Hawaiian royalty into contact with California's industrial aristocracy, mixing cultures in the hotel's lobbies and dining rooms. On January 20th, 1891, Kalakaua died in his palace suite. He remains the only reigning monarch to die on American soil. The hotel hosted his state funeral, an event that drew international attention and underscored San Francisco's position as a Pacific Rim capital. By the late 1890s, the Grand Court had evolved. The circular carriage drive disappeared. In its place appeared dozens of potted palms, transforming the space into what became known as the Palm Court. Tropical plants reached toward the skylight 7 stories above. Tables replaced cobblestones. The space that once echoed with horse hooves now hosted afternoon tea service. The Palm Court became the hotel's signature gathering place. San Francisco's elite met there every afternoon, conducting business over china cups, while society matrons evaluated the latest European fashions on display. Political power brokers occupied corner tables, their conversations shaping California's future, while waiters glided between palms carrying silver trays. The hotel hosted society weddings that filled the ballrooms with hundreds of guests. Business conventions brought railroad executives, mining entrepreneurs, banking delegations. The palace had become more than accommodation. It served as San Francisco's commercial and social center, the place where wealth and influence congregated. By 1900, San Francisco's population approached 350,000. The city had grown far beyond its gold rush origins, establishing itself as the financial capital of the Pacific Coast. At the center of this transformation stood the Palace Hotel, its 7 stories symbolizing California's Gilded Age prosperity. In spring of 1906, the Metropolitan Opera arrived from New York for its San Francisco engagement. The company brought sets, costumes, and orchestra its full roster of performers. Among them, Enrico Caruso, already recognized as the world's greatest tenor. Hotel management assigned him a suite on the 5th floor. On the evening of April 17th, Caruso performed the role of Don Jose in Carmen at the Grand Opera House on Mission Street. The performance ended around 10:30. He returned to the palace, likely dining late as was his custom, then retired to his suite well after midnight. That same evening, approximately 800 guests occupied rooms throughout the hotel's 7 floors. Business travelers, society figures, families on California tours, the usual clientele for a Wednesday night in April. Staff worked late shifts preparing for Thursday's breakfast service, polishing silver in the Palm Court, maintaining the hydraulic elevators that carried guests to upper floors. The hotel settled into its pre-dawn stillness. Guests slept behind mahogany doors. Night clerks manned the front desk. Maintenance staff checked the boilers in the basement. Everything continued as it had for 30 years. In just over 4 hours, everything would change. Chapter 8, 5 a.m. At 5:12 on Wednesday morning, April 18, 1906, a foreshock rumbled through San Francisco. The tremor lasted perhaps 20 seconds, strong enough to wake light sleepers, mild enough that most guests at the Palace Hotel never felt it through their mattresses. 20 seconds of silence followed. Then the earth broke. A segment of the San Andreas Fault stretching from Cape Mendocino to San Juan Bautista, 296 miles of California coastline, began to slip. The Pacific Plate lurched northward against the North American Plate. In some locations, the ground shifted 20 feet in an instant. The rupture traveled at 8,300 miles per hour, faster than any commercial aircraft would fly for decades to come. The shaking reached San Francisco within 30 seconds. Enrico Caruso woke in his 5th-floor suite feeling his bed rock, as though I am on a ship on my way to my beautiful country. The sensation lasted perhaps 5 seconds before the main shock arrived. Then the Palace Hotel began to dance. 7 stories of iron-reinforced brick, 26 million bricks laid over 3 years, the largest hotel west of the Mississippi. All of it moved. The building swayed. Windows exploded outward, showering Market Street with glass. Chimneys collapsed through roofs. Plaster fell from ceilings in white clouds. The glass skylight above the Palm Court shattered, sending 7 stories of crystal crashing down onto tables still set for breakfast. The earthquake lasted 45 seconds. Guests stumbled from their rooms into hallways filled with dust and screaming. Some had been thrown from their beds. Others stood in doorways clutching whatever they could grab. The hydraulic elevators had stopped working. Everyone would need to use the stairs. Caruso looked out his window. Across the street, brick buildings collapsed into Market Street. Walls fell outward, burying people under debris. He watched the street itself undulate in waves, cobblestones rising and falling as if the earth had become liquid. Somewhere in the city, fire alarms were ringing. Throughout the hotel, guests made their way down darkened stairwells. Some carried suitcases, others wore only night clothes. Staff members tried to maintain order, directing people toward exits, accounting for guests. But the palace had approximately 800 guests across 7 floors, and only the stairwells remained passable. The shaking had stopped, but the building continued to settle. Cracks appeared in walls. More plaster fell. The damage was severe, but the structure had held. Testament to John Gaynor's iron-reinforcing and earthquake-conscious design, the palace had survived. Outside, dawn revealed a transformed city. The earthquake had been felt from Oregon to Los Angeles, from the Pacific to Nevada. But San Francisco, built largely on filled dirt and reclaimed marshland, had suffered catastrophically. The City Hall had partially collapsed. The Grand Opera House, where Caruso had performed 9 hours earlier, lay in ruins. Entire blocks of residential buildings had pancaked into rubble. Most ominous, fires had started across the city. Overturned stoves, broken gas lines, severed electrical wires. Dozens of ignition points sparked to life in the aftermath. And the earthquake had destroyed the city's water mains. Fire brigades arrived at hydrants to find them dry. The 630,000-gallon reservoir under the Palace Hotel represented one of the largest water supplies remaining in downtown San Francisco. By 6 o'clock, Caruso stood in Union Square with most of the palace's guests. His valet had retrieved 54 steamer trunks from the 5th floor. Someone immediately tried to steal them. A soldier intervened when Caruso identified himself as the tenor who had performed the previous evening. Fame retained some currency even in catastrophe. The palace still stood. Guests gathered on Market Street, looking up at the 7-story structure. Some expressed amazement that such a large building had withstood the shaking. Others pointed to cracks in the facade, to broken windows, to damage visible from the street. A few discussed returning to their rooms to collect belongings. But smoke was rising from buildings to the south, and to the north, and to the west. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan had been killed when a chimney fell through his firehouse during the earthquake. His deputy, John Dougherty, now commanded firefighters who had no water and faced multiple fires spreading through a city built largely of wood. The palace stood in the heart of the downtown commercial district, surrounded by office buildings, hotels, shops, all potential fuel. By mid-morning, guests had scattered throughout the city. Some found transportation out of San Francisco. Others joined crowds heading toward Golden Gate Park, where the army was setting up refugee camps. Caruso eventually paid $700, an enormous sum, for a cart to carry his trunks to the Oakland ferry. The palace stood empty. Its iron frame had held. Its brick walls remained standing. The reservoir in the basement still contained thousands of gallons of water. For 31 years, the hotel had dominated Market Street, the symbol of San Francisco's Gilded Age prosperity. It had survived the earthquake that William Ralston had feared when he specified iron reinforcing during construction. But fire moved differently than earthquakes. Fire didn't need to shake buildings apart. It just needed fuel and wind. And San Francisco was burning. Chapter 9. The Irony. Through the morning hours of April 18th, fire spread across San Francisco. What began as dozens of separate blazes, started by overturned stoves, broken gas lines, severed electrical wires, merged into massive conflagrations that consumed entire neighborhoods. The ham and eggs fire ignited when a woman in Hayes Valley lit her breakfast stove unaware of a damaged chimney, destroyed 30 blocks. South of Market, where wooden residential buildings had collapsed onto each other during the earthquake, became an inferno that killed dozens trapped in rubble. Firefighters fought without water. The earthquake had broken more than 300 water mains throughout the city. The reservoirs in the hills remained full, but 6 miles of pipeline that carried water downtown lay shattered along the San Andreas Fault's rupture zone. Crews arrived at hydrants to find them dry. They pumped sewers for wastewater. They pulled salt water from the bay. They searched desperately for any source that might slow the advancing flames. Fire Chief Dennis Sullivan, who would have coordinated the response, lay dying from injuries sustained when a chimney collapsed through his firehouse during the earthquake. His deputy, John Dougherty, commanded firefighters who faced an impossible situation. Multiple fires, no water, winds from the Pacific pushing flames eastward through the city, and downtown San Francisco, the financial district, the hotels, the commercial center, directly in the path. The Palace Hotel stood near the heart of the downtown district. Throughout the morning, the building appeared increasingly isolated. Fires approached from the south, consuming the working-class neighborhoods below Market Street. Flames moved in from the west, destroying residential areas. To the north, fires spread through Chinatown and the financial district. The palace sat in a tightening circle of smoke and heat. But the palace had water. 630,000 gallons filled the massive brick and cement reservoir beneath the Palm Court. 7 tanks on the roof held another 130,000 gallons. 4 artesian wells fed the system continuously at 28,000 gallons per hour. Ralston had spent a fortune on this redundancy, terrified of fire, determined that his hotel would withstand catastrophe. The building featured 392 hose outlets throughout its 7 floors, 15,000 feet of fire hose, 7 steam pumps to force water through the system. By noon, Acting Fire Chief Dougherty understood what those numbers represented. The Palace Hotel possessed one of the largest remaining water supplies in downtown San Francisco, possibly the largest. While the city's mains ran dry, the palace sat atop an underground lake. Firefighters faced a choice. They could preserve the palace's water to protect the hotel itself, or they could use it to create fire breaks elsewhere, sacrificing the palace's supply in an attempt to save surrounding blocks. Perhaps save the commercial district. Perhaps prevent the fire from reaching the waterfront. Dougherty made the decision. The water would be used. Crews connected hoses to the palace's external standpipes on Market Street. The system had been designed for exactly this purpose. 8 4-inch fire mains under the sidewalks allowed city engines to pump water from the hotel's reservoir. Steam pumps activated. Water that Ralston had stored to protect his hotel began flowing outward to fight fires blocks away. The reservoir level dropped. The artesian wells could not refill it fast enough. 28,000 gallons per hour could not match the rate firefighters pumped water out. Hour by hour through the afternoon, the hotel's supply diminished. Meanwhile, the fires continued advancing. By early afternoon, flames reached the blocks immediately surrounding the palace. The Grand Hotel across New Montgomery Street caught fire. The Monadnock building to the south began burning. One by one, the structures that formed the palace's neighborhood ignited. Wooden interiors provided fuel. Broken windows created drafts that fed flames. Fire jumped from building to building, carried by wind and flying embers. Around 2 o'clock, fire reached the palace itself. The hotel had survived the earthquake with minimal structural damage. Ralston's iron reinforcing had held. The brick walls stood firm. But fire didn't need to shake a building apart. Fire just needed fuel and oxygen. The palace provided both. Despite Ralston's precautions, despite the iron framing, the brick walls, the supposedly fireproof construction, the interior contained miles of wooden paneling. Redwood lined the hallways. Mahogany furniture filled the suites. Wooden doors, wooden floors, wooden trim throughout 7 stories. The building was an iron and brick shell filled with kindling. Flames entered through broken windows. They found the wooden interiors and began to spread. Hotel staff had remained throughout the morning, hoping to save the structure. Now they evacuated. There was nothing more they could do. The reservoir by this point was nearly empty. The 7 roof tanks had been pumped dry hours earlier. The water that Ralston had installed to save his hotel had been used to fight fires elsewhere. When flames engulfed the palace itself, the building had no defense. By late afternoon, the entire structure burned. Flames shot from windows on all 7 floors. The glass skylight above the palm court exploded from heat. The tropical plants that had replaced carriages burned. The mahogany reception desk burned. 30 years of accumulated luxury. The finest furniture, the imported carpets, the crystal chandeliers, all of it burned. And soldiers and firefighters stood on Market Street and watched. There was nothing they could do. The water was gone. William Ralston had built the largest hotel west of the Mississippi. He had specified iron reinforcing to survive earthquakes. He had installed the most sophisticated fire suppression system in San Francisco. He had stored 630,000 gallons of water specifically to protect his creation, and in the end, that water had been used to fight fires everywhere except the palace. The irony would not be lost on San Francisco's historians. The hotel designed to be fireproof, the building with its own water supply, the structure that had survived the earthquake, destroyed because firefighters had pumped its reservoir dry fighting fires elsewhere. By evening, only the brick walls remained standing. The interior was gone. The Palace Hotel, symbol of San Francisco's Gilded Age prosperity, had burned to its iron skeleton. Chapter 10. From the Ashes. The Palace Hotel's brick walls stood for 156 days before demolition began. Ralston had built too well. The iron-reinforced structure, designed to survive earthquakes and fire, had survived the earthquake. The fire had gutted the interior but left the skeleton intact. Workers spent 5 months tearing down what the disaster could not destroy. While demolition crews worked on Market Street, the Sharon Estate Company moved quickly to preserve the palace name. On August 23, 1906, 4 months after the earthquake, Frederick Sharon and Francis Newlands filed articles of incorporation for a new palace hotel company. The family that had inherited William Sharon's holdings would rebuild. They needed a temporary solution. San Franciscans had lost their grand hotel, their social center, their symbol of pre-earthquake elegance. The city was rebuilding rapidly, but the new palace would require years of construction. The Sharon Estate commissioned a stopgap, the Baby Palace. Construction began 8 blocks west of the ruins at Post and Leavenworth Streets. A modest 2-story wooden structure, 23 rooms, nothing approaching the original's grandeur. But it would carry the name. On November 17, 1906, 7 months after the earthquake, the Baby Palace opened with considerable ceremony. Ernest Arbogast, the original palace's celebrated chef, managed the small hotel. San Francisco society attended the opening, grateful for any connection to what had been lost. The Baby Palace operated for 8 months. In July 1907, the Palace Hotel Company leased the newly rebuilt Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill for 10 years, moving operations there while the permanent replacement took shape on Market Street. The Baby Palace building was leased to the Olympic Club as temporary quarters. By 1916, it would be replaced by a 4-story apartment building. Meanwhile, architects from New York arrived to design the real palace. The Sharon Estate hired Trowbridge and Livingston, a prestigious firm known for the St. Regis Hotel, the Knickerbocker, B. Altman and Company's department store. Samuel Trowbridge and Goodhue Livingston had built their reputation on Beaux-Arts elegance and institutional grandeur. They would bring that sensibility to San Francisco. George Kellum, a young architect from Trowbridge and Livingston, came west to supervise construction. He would remain in San Francisco for the rest of his career, becoming one of the city's most important architects. But first, he would rebuild the palace. The design aimed to capture the original's palatial character while incorporating lessons from 1906. The new building would rise 9 stories instead of 7. Steel framing would replace iron reinforcing. Renaissance revival details would add classical gravitas to the exterior. Most importantly, the interior would be concrete and steel, not wood. At the center of the design sat the garden court. The original hotel's grand court had served as a carriage entrance, a covered space where horses and vehicles delivered guests under a glass skylight. The new design converted that space into a dining room, 110 feet long by 85 feet wide, 70,000 pieces of leaded glass in the ceiling, 20 Austrian crystal chandeliers, 16 marble columns imported from Italy, the grandest public space in San Francisco. Construction began in late 1907. The site had been cleared. The foundations, some of Ralston's original work, remained usable. Steel framing rose through 1908. Workers installed the glass ceiling piece by piece through the summer. The chandeliers arrived from Europe. Marble came from Italian quarries. Craftsmen carved Renaissance details into limestone facades. The project cost $10 million, twice what Ralston had spent on the original. But this palace would be truly fireproof. Steel and concrete throughout. Sprinkler systems on every floor. Multiple water sources. The lessons of April 18, 1906, had been expensive but clear. The hotel opened on December 19, 1909, 3 years, 8 months, and 1 day after the fire. Frederick Sharon, William Sharon's son, used a golden key to unlock the main doors. Thousands attended the opening. They walked through the marble lobby, past the Maxfield Parrish mural that would become the Pied Piper Bar's centerpiece, into the garden court. The space stunned visitors. Afternoon light filtered through 70,000 pieces of glass, casting patterns across marble floors. The chandeliers, each weighing 700 pounds, hung from steel cables. Tropical plants filled corners, an echo of the old palm court. Tables spread across the floor where carriages had once rolled. This was not Ralston's palace. The building was plainer on the outside, more refined on the inside. The Victorian exuberance had given way to Edwardian restraint. But the ambition remained. The palace would again be San Francisco's social center, its grand hotel, its symbol of prosperity recovered. The original palace had represented San Francisco's Gilded Age dreams, built in 1875 when the city was barely 30 years old, when silver wealth poured out of Nevada, when anything seemed possible. That hotel had burned with the Victorian city it represented. This palace represented something else: resilience. San Francisco had been destroyed and rebuilt in less than 4 years. The downtown commercial district had risen from ash. The Palace Hotel stood again on Market Street, larger and grander than before. William Ralston had not lived to see his hotel open. William Sharon had died before the earthquake. But the Sharon estate had rebuilt what fire destroyed. The palace endured as San Francisco endured, transformed but unbroken. Chapter 11. The Survivor. The Palace Hotel resumed its position at the center of San Francisco life. Presidents returned. Theodore Roosevelt stayed there. William Howard Taft. Woodrow Wilson used the Garden Court in 1919 to speak in support of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, trying to persuade a skeptical nation to join the international order emerging from the Great War. On August 2, 1923, President Warren G. Harding died in room 8064, an 8th-floor suite overlooking Market Street. He had arrived by train days earlier, exhausted from a cross-country tour defending his troubled administration. Heart problems killed him at age 57. His wife refused an autopsy, spawning conspiracy theories that persisted for decades. The palace added another president to its list of distinguished guests, this time as the place where his life ended. In 1945, as World War II reached its conclusion, the palace hosted a banquet marking the opening session of the United Nations. Diplomats from 50 nations gathered in the Garden Court while the organization that would define the post-war world took shape in San Francisco. The hotel that had represented Gilded Age ambition now witnessed the birth of a new international order. The Sharon estate sold the palace to Sheraton Hotels in 1954. The hotel became the Sheraton Palace, joining a national chain while maintaining its historic identity. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev spoke at a banquet there during his 1959 American tour. Cold War tensions temporarily set aside for diplomatic ceremonies. In 1969, the Garden Court received official recognition as San Francisco Landmark No. 18, acknowledging what everyone already knew. It remained one of the world's most beautiful public spaces. Sheraton's parent company, ITT, sold the palace to Japan's Kyoya Group in 1973, along with their Hawaiian hotel properties. Sheraton continued managing the operation. The name stayed the same. Guests still dined under 70,000 pieces of glass, still drank in the Pied Piper bar beneath Maxfield Parrish's mural, still walked through marble lobbies that connected them to a century of San Francisco history. But by the late 1980s, the palace showed its age. 8 decades of continuous operation had worn the infrastructure. The elegance remained, but the systems behind it needed comprehensive overhaul. In January 1989, the owners closed the hotel for complete top-to-bottom restoration. The project would take years and cost tens of millions. Everything would be upgraded, modernized, brought to contemporary standards while preserving historic character. 10 months into the restoration, on October 17, 1989, San Francisco experienced its first major earthquake since 1906. The Loma Prieta earthquake struck at 5:04 p.m., magnitude 6.9, centered 70 miles south of the city. The palace, empty during renovation, its interior stripped, its systems exposed, suffered considerable structural damage. The earthquake that had destroyed Ralston's palace had lasted 45 seconds. This one lasted 15. But it was enough to halt restoration work and require new engineering plans. The irony was not lost on anyone. The palace stood on Market Street for 31 years before the 1906 earthquake destroyed it. The rebuilt palace lasted 80 years before another earthquake damaged it during renovation. San Francisco and earthquakes remained inseparable. The restoration continued with new priorities. Seismic retrofitting became central to the project. Engineers reinforced the steel frame, upgraded connections, installed systems to help the building flex during ground movement. The palace would survive the next earthquake. The work took another year and a half. Cost exceeded $150 million. On April 3, 1991, the palace reopened. Guests checked in for the first time in 27 months. The garden court gleamed. Every one of 70,000 glass pieces had been removed, cleaned, repaired where necessary, replaced in a rebuilt frame beneath a new outer skylight. The 20 Austrian crystal chandeliers, each weighing 700 pounds, had been restored. New marble matched old. The space looked as it had in 1909, but now it rested on a foundation engineered to survive what San Francisco's geology might deliver. The hotel resumed operations. Presidents continued visiting. Bill Clinton stayed there. Barack Obama would follow. Business travelers filled the rooms. Tourists booked afternoon tea in the garden court. The Pied Piper bar served cocktails beneath Parrish's painting. The palace remained what it had been since 1909, San Francisco's grand hotel, its connection to Gilded Age grandeur, its symbol of resilience. In 2010, the palace joined Historic Hotels of America, official recognition of its significance to American hospitality history. Another round of renovations in 2015 focused on preserving the pool, promenade, and garden court. In 2016, Historic Hotels of America gave the palace its Award of Excellence for Best Historic Hotel in the over 400-room category. By 2025, the palace had stood on Market Street for 116 years in its current form. Add the 31 years of the original building, and the site had hosted San Francisco's Grand Hotel for 147 years. 19 United States presidents had stayed there. 2 men had died there. King Kalakaua in 1891, President Harding in 1923. The hotel had survived 2 major earthquakes. Barely. It had adapted to each era: Gilded Age opulence, progressive reform, Jazz Age excess, Depression austerity, post-war prosperity, modern globalization. The palace endured because San Francisco endured. The city that rebuilt from 1906's ashes had rebuilt again and again, after Loma Prieta, after economic downturns, after every challenge its geography and history delivered. The palace stood at Market and New Montgomery as it had since 1909, grand and slightly faded, historic and functional, connecting contemporary San Francisco to the ambitions of William Ralston, the ruthlessness of William Sharon, the tragedy of April 18, 1906, and the resilience that followed. The hotel William Ralston never saw open had outlasted him by 150 years. William Ralston drowned in San Francisco Bay on August 27, 1875. His body was recovered near Meigs Wharf. 50,000 people attended his funeral. 2 months later, the Palace Hotel opened without him. The hotel cost him everything. The $5 million he poured into construction drained the Bank of California. The loans he authorized to himself blurred the distinction between personal ambition and fiduciary duty. When depositors ran on the bank, his empire collapsed in hours. His partner William Sharon acquired his assets for pennies on the dollar, including the hotel Ralston had dreamed of building. Ralston designed the palace to survive earthquake and fire. He specified iron reinforcing when other builders used wood. He installed a 630,000-gallon reservoir when other hotels relied on city water. He built the largest, most technologically advanced hotel west of the Mississippi. It survived the 1906 earthquake. The iron framing held. The brick walls stood. Then firefighters pumped the reservoir dry fighting fires elsewhere, and the hotel burned anyway. The water Ralston installed to save his creation was used to save other buildings. The irony defined the palace's story. The hotel was rebuilt. It opened again in 1909, grander than before. It survived the 20th century, survived another earthquake in 1989, survived every challenge San Francisco's geography and economics delivered. 150 years after Ralston's death, the palace still stands on Market Street. Ralston never walked through his hotel's doors. He never saw guests arrive under the glass skylight. He never hosted presidents in its suites. He died believing he had failed. But the palace endures. And William Ralston, dead at 49 with nothing to his name, built something that outlasted him by more than a century.